and all cheer and shout and give our thanks and praise to the Lamb who was slain. Indeed, he is worthy, and that's really what we're talking about tonight. This season of Epiphany for the next couple of Sundays are all kind of the revelation and the signs and the proof positive that Jesus is who God said he is, who God said he would send. Really, Epiphany is about answering the question, what child is this? Well, we're about to find out, because he's definitely no normal child. Matthew chapter 2 recounts this history. So we're going to go ahead and walk through from verses 1 through 12, covering and expounding upon the word that the Lord has given us. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Now we know that Jesus was his earthly name. It's the name that was given to Joseph, that he would call this child Jesus, for he should save his people. Jesus, of course, being the Greek version of Joshua. And Joshua in Hebrew is Yeshua, which means Yahweh saves. It's part of his nature and his character. Names meant something, especially back then. Now, of course, he was born in the city of Bethlehem, and those of you who are here, I'll just give a quick recap through the prophets. Bethlehem, as it was recorded in Micah and quoted here for us, Bethlehem is the house of bread. That's what the word Bethlehem means. Jesus, of course, calls himself the bread of life. It was the city of David, a small town about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. So it was close to kind of where the action was, so to speak. And this Bethlehem, as you remember from Micah, was called Ephrathah, or Ephrath, which is fruitfulness. So it's interesting that God would have, born in the city of David, his son who would be bread for the people and who would bring about fruitfulness, as he is the vine and we are the branches. Connected to him, of course, we bear much fruit. This Bethlehem was differentiated, of course, from the Bethlehem in the land of Zebulun in the northern part of Israel. Now, of course, it says here, King Herod. King Herod. Just a little background about King Herod. His name, Herod, means heroic. Now, of course, he was anything but a hero to the people of Israel because he wasn't a proper king. He was not an Israelite, but rather an Edomite. Remember that Edomites were the children of Esau. You had Jacob, who was named Israel. You had Esau. The Edomites gave Israel problems for a long time, but he was able to work his way up, valiant in battle. He was a great military strategist. And in 37 BC, he actually finally took over reign of Judea, placed by Emperor Octavian. See, the Romans were still in charge, and they found favor, so they placed King Herod the Great there. Now, where this comes into play is that King Herod was merciless. Before King Herod, who was an Edomite, there was another dynasty that had reigned. These were the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans were the dynasty of the Maccabees. Maybe you've heard of that book from the Apocrypha. The Maccabees, that Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids. All of this comes into play not just for a history lesson, but to show you that with a change of dynasty, Israel was in a time of great unrest. King Herod had taken over, and in his fear, in his paranoia, his wife, who just happened to be a Hasmonean, was executed. And then, of course, the 2 sons that she had bore, well, they were a threat too, so why not just kill your children? So he killed his own 2 children too. This was the kind of ruler that was in charge. By the way, if you think America is run poorly, well, I don't think that's happened yet. So, things could always be much worse. So this was their king. Now, on the bright side of this, he was a great military strategist who was able to do and keep Israel fairly secure from their enemies under the Roman rule, but he was also a great builder. Later on in the Gospels, we're going to read about these great stones and this marvelous temple and the gold that was on the gates. Well, that was all King Herod the Great. He was trying to win the favor of the people, even though he was never able to truly get it. Now, King Herod, for all of his wickedness, his vileness, and everything else, I want to point out something very important, that even the most evil and wicked and heinous and godless people in the world are not outside of the purvey of God. They're not able to escape God's plan, whether they like it or not. The prophet Hosea, chapter 11, verse 1, writes this, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt." Out of Egypt. We all know, of course, that story, that travel, the nativity, and such. Well, King Herod is going to be so paranoid about this new king to come that he's going to slay the innocents. An angel's going to appear. Mary and Joseph are going to take off to Egypt, so that while they're there for a little bit and King Herod dies and his sons take over, he could come out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I've called my son. King Herod didn't even know that he was going to play right into the hand of God's prophecies. Now, we move on to verse 2. I know we're making light speed ahead here. "Where is he?" This is what the wise men say. "Where is he who's been born King of the Jews? For we've seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." Now, you might be wondering, where and how did wise men from the east, quick geography lesson, if you stand in Jerusalem and you face east, what country are you looking at? Babylon. Well, at least ancient Babylon. Today it would be Iraq and the rest of those countries, but Babylon. So wise men from the east know that there's a star, there's a sign in the heavens that means the Christ child was going to be born. Where would they have ever figured that out? Well, here's where all of your Sunday school lessons come into play. By the way, if you don't send your children to Sunday school, please send them so that they'll be educated and maybe win on Jeopardy. I'm amazed how many times those categories come up. Bibles, and then of course my family looks at me and you better get them all right. I'll do my best. It's a big book. All right. So, Daniel was one of the children who was carried away by King Nebuchadnezzar. And we remember that Daniel was very faithful in the land. And it's most certainly plausible, possible, and probably the way it went, that Daniel explained true wisdom that comes from the Lord, and that God would send his promised Messiah. See, as we saw in Isaiah, God has never been just about Israel. Yes, Israel's important, and he chose Jacob and the sons of Israel to bring forth the Messiah. But if you can read Isaiah 60 and not see that God wanted the whole world to worship the Messiah, I don't know if there's any help for you. It says the Gentiles will come. The Gentiles will give you their wealth. Yes, that's exactly what we do. For we are children of God as well. And we are children of the promise. Not the promise of the Old Testament covenant, that was for Israel, but we are children of the promise of a New Testament. When Christ comes and says he has sheep of another fold, when Christ comes and says a new covenant, I give you in my blood. We're all part of that. So Daniel told him about what was to come, and he explained everything, and then they saw his star. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an astronomy lesson here. By the way, I'm not an astronomer. If I get something wrong here, please feel free to let me know. But this is how I understand it. A little bit hard to see, but in the book of Revelation, St. John writes something interesting, and I'm going to show you how all of this ties in. If you've seen this before, it's pretty fascinating. Revelation chapter 12, verse 1. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and her head upon it a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads, 10 horns, 7 diadems on his heads. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and his throne. Well, it doesn't take a genius to realize that what John is writing about is the birth of Jesus Christ. And the dragon, specifically here, would be Herod, who sought to destroy the child right at the beginning, as is recorded in Matthew. He says something interesting, though. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet. I love living in 2019 because science and computers let us do awesome things. Now, we know that the stars in the heaven are fixed in terms of their rotation, and their accuracy is phenomenal. So with computers, we can actually go back over 2,000 years, plant ourselves in Jerusalem or Babylon, and look to the east, the west, the north, and the south, and see exactly what they would have seen. And what's absolutely remarkable and astronomical fact is that if you go back in time and you look in the sky, you'll see Virgo, a virgin. That right there is our sun. The moon is right there at her feet. So I saw a sign in heaven, a woman clothed in the sun with the moon at her feet with 12 stars around her diadem. That's the constellation Leo, the lion of the tribe of Judah. Amazing, huh? And then you have Jupiter right over there. All of this, Regulus and all of these things, all kind of come together for amazing signs in heaven. And here's where it gets a little bit better. Again, I know it's tough to see, the sun's in our backdrop, but what happened 9 months after that last picture I showed you in the heavens was this phenomenon that could be seen in the Near East. That right there is not one star. It's actually 2 stars. They're not really stars, they're actually planets. It's the planet Venus and the planet Jupiter, the mother planet and the father planet, coming together so that with the naked eye it appears to be one. They didn't have Hubble telescopes and other stuff. But if you looked up into the sky, most astronomers believe that that would be the greatest and the brightest of lights in the heavens. Wow. Pretty fascinating, pretty amazing. And that all happened 2,000 years ago. And here's where it gets a little bit better, because our text tells us, I'm skipping ahead just a little bit, and then I'll come back. It tells us that the star stood. Now, there's an interesting phenomenon from our viewpoint called retrograde movement. Now, again, there's not going to be a test after this. Don't worry about it. But I want to show you how awesome God is in planning these things out to give us the truth and sure up our faith. Retrograde movement. This here is a star, a planet reflecting light. And what happens is, as we look at it in a time lapse, as it moves across the heavens, it makes an ellipsis. Well, what happens at the end of an ellipsis? From our viewpoint, it stands still. Now, it's not standing still, it's moving, it's in rotation, but as you can see from here, retrograde motion says anytime you take a look at the stars in the heaven, they're going to appear in different places. Well, over here at like E and C, it's going to appear to stop. So how could a star rest over a place and not move? Well, that's at least one explanation, and this phenomenon happens all the time. See, God put these signs and these wonders in the heavens for us to be able to say, praise be to the Lord. These signs and these wonders are for us to match up in His Word and just be in awe of the precision and the way that God works. How wonderful and amazing it is that God does this for us. All the signs and stuff are right there. So these wise men from the east, who didn't have Fortnite or Netflix and spent a lot of their time studying the heavens, there was nothing much to do once the sun went down, they saw this star. They recognized it from the prophecies, and they head east, or I should say they head west. They're from the east, and they meet up with King Herod. And they say they want to worship him. Now what's interesting, of course, is if they had been taught by Daniel, they would have known the first commandment. What's the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. So why are they showing up to worship a king? Well, it's because they know something that the rest of the world out there doesn't really quite get yet. He's not just a king, he is the King of kings, the Lord of lords, the Lord's Christ, the one who had come to save the world, to worship him. Now, every now and again, you'll get a knock on your door. I love watching them come around, and I try and follow them from house to house to house. And they're going to try and tell you not to worship Jesus. Now, what's interesting is words have meaning. You can't just change the meaning of a word because you feel like changing the meaning of a word. Cat is a cat because it's a cat. If you call the cat a rhinoceros, well, I don't know what I'd call you, but I'd have to be nice about it. Words have meaning. So the word worship here means exactly what it says it does. We get our context from what Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke. Luke chapter 4, verse 8, he says, you must worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Well, the word worship there is the very same one that the magi use, which is the very same one that Herod uses, which is the very same one that Matthew tells us when they finally get to the house and they see the child, they fall before him and worship. Doesn't mean something different. It's the very same word. So if we're worshiping Christ, if they were worshiping the baby, if they were right in line with God, and there's other places where that comes up, I don't have time to cover them all. If they were doing that, that means this child is something far beyond just a human king. He is the King of kings and the Lord of lords. So we continue. He sent them to Bethlehem after he had called the wise men to figure it out. That's from the prophet Micah. Sent them to Bethlehem and saying, bring back word so I can worship him too. And here's where that awful, terrible, wicked Herod was at, is he's full of lies. He didn't want to worship the child. He wanted to kill the child. See, the king is only interested in his own power. And, governments don't exist to try and do anything other than continue their own existence. That's why they continually raise taxes. They tell you it's for your good, but that's not generally how it works out. This ruler would be different. He would not be there just to rule over, but he would be, as it says, a shepherd to the people. This is so important to understand. Our God is a shepherd. He's a shepherd because his interest, his care, and he lays down his life for the sheep. He's not like the rulers of this world who kill their own wives and their children, who take bribes and act in all sorts of uncouth ways. He is a ruler who loves with an unfailing love, who gives his life for us. What a wonderful ruler we can share with this world to tell them about him. When they heard the king, they left. It says that star stood. Maybe it was a different phenomenon, but either way, they led right to where the young child was. They were filled with joy. They came into the house and they saw the young child with Mary, his mother. They fell down and worshiped him. They opened up their treasures and presented gifts to him. As we're nearing the end of this, I just want to wrap up kind of the importance of what the Scripture says. It says they gave their worship to him, not to Mary, not to Joseph, not to anyone else. They gave their worship to him because he's the king and the only one who is worthy of all of our glory, laud, and praise. He's the only one who is worthy to receive our praise. And then they gave their gifts to him, that is to Jesus. They weren't trying to honor Mary. They weren't trying to exalt Joseph. They were giving their gifts to the king. Now that was mediated certainly through Mary and Joseph, if Joseph was still around. And that is how it happens. So important to recognize that Mary and Joseph, the Holy Family, they were part of God's plan, just as we are. Just as we are. Each of us in our vocations have a part to play and a time to step up and be part. Be part of what God is doing in the world, because God hasn't stopped working. Now, real quick, as a side note, I'm a stickler for these things sometimes. Number one, this was not the night of the shepherds. This was later. So whenever you see wise men and shepherds and a bunch of others all hanging around the manger, it's a little bit inaccurate. And then the other thing, too, was when you take a look at this, we sing, "We Three Kings." Well, the Bible nowhere says there's three. We get that from, of course, gold and frankincense and myrrh, but the truth is we don't know how many there were. My guess is there was a whole massive envoy, overly joyed and overly excited to go and worship the king. Were you excited when you woke up this morning that you got to come here today? Probably not now, because I've gone on way too much, but were you excited when you woke up? You're going, this is great. I get the opportunity to gather with my fellow believers and praise the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, to come into a presence where God is welcoming. Because that's really what this is all about. It's about Gentiles going to a Jewish mother with a Jewish king, uniting all of the families of earth together to sing their praise that God was faithful in sending his promise. The truth of the matter is that God works in mysterious ways. He's orchestrating all of the things in the universe, and we can't even begin to know what he's doing when it comes to the way that he works. But the what of his works are not a mystery. There's no secret. It has been absolutely revealed and declared, and you can with all confidence leave from this place, and anyone that says nay, you say yea. Yea, yes, and amen, Lord Jesus Christ, come again. The signs are in the heavens. His prophecies have been fulfilled, and we can rejoice that there's a few more to come when he comes back to get us. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.